The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM.
We're here at the ELL Collaborative Summer Academy at Middle Tennessee State University and starting our second session of the day, and this is the day for administrators. I want to welcome Dr. Jana McLean, who is faculty in the Elementary and Special Education Department at MTSU College of Education. And I'd like to welcome Ms. Ariel Mosley, who is the English Language Development Specialist at Murfreesboro City Schools. Dr. McLean and Ms. Mosley have prepared a session specifically for administrators. So the title of the presentation is The Science of Reading and Multilingualism, Supporting the Literacy and Language Development of English Learners. So this is a topic that is requested quite often in our feedback in the collaborative, so we're so happy to have this session today, Dr. McLean, Ms. Mosley. So please.
Hi, we're so glad to be here today. So thankful for the opportunity to speak with administrators, because often when we're speaking with teachers, we tell them things that they go, well, I don't have any control over that, right? This is not my decision to make. And so the opportunity to speak with administrators who do have the power, the agency to make some of these decisions is just such an honor. I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity. So you'll notice a little bit about us. Dr. Sung-Yoon Lee helped us in the development of this presentation, but he is in South Korea at the moment, and so not able to join us to present, but I did want to make sure and give him credit for the work that he did to help us in developing this presentation. As Dr. Clark mentioned, I am a faculty member here at the MTSU College of Education. I work primarily, my placement is in the Department of Elementary and Special Education, and I focus on courses that center diversity and cultural and linguistic diversity. I'm also an affiliate faculty member with the PhD in Literacy Studies. So my PhD is in Language, Literacy, and Culture from Vanderbilt University, and my research interests are really focused in literacy. And so I'm here today with Ariel Mosley, who's a wonderful practitioner who really helps us think through how do we merge the theory and practice.
Yes, we just kind of came together. I don't know, it's just a divine intervention. So I am Ariel Mosley. I am the ELD specialist at Murfreesboro City Schools. This is my third year. I'm going to my third year. I made it 2 years. I have about 15 years experience working with multilingual learners. Most of my time was in Rutherford County with Nona Hall and Andrea Bontempi, about 10 years there. And then 2 years in Texas at a dual language school. And then I came back to Murfreesboro and I landed this position with Murfreesboro City Schools. So I've been here for 3 years now. So we're going to talk a little bit about, what we've come up with. So we're really bridging research and we're bridging practice together. So I'm the practice side. She's the genius on the research.
I also have a little bit of practical experience. I worked for a decade approximately in public schools, first teaching high school German and then elementary English learners in Murfreesboro City Schools right around the corner. So I know several familiar faces of people I've taught with and love the opportunity to work with again. So our objectives for today, we're going to start with some foundational information, and this may be a bit redundant for those of you who've been teaching English learners or are working with English learners for quite some time. But we do think it's important to revisit what are some foundational understandings to inform the rest of our session. Things like who are English learners or multilingual learners? What are their protected rights? And what are the demographic shifts that have happened that really impact the decisions we make in schools today? The second objective we have today is to really think deeply about the relationship between language and literacy. And how is literacy development different for multilingual or bilingual students? What's the importance of phonics for literacy? And what's the importance of language development for literacy? And why English language development really matters. It's really important. And I think some of the conversations we've had this morning really reiterate how important English language development is. I think your question was a really pertinent one about, okay, is just having an ESL endorsed teacher enough? Or is that ESL teacher actually providing English language development? Because that English language development really does matter for their literacy development of all students actually, but in particular for our multilingual learners. And then we're going to take a little break, as Dr. Clark mentioned. We'll have a lunch break, and when we come back, we'll think a little bit more directly about the pragmatic implications for programs. What does this research say about, how does the research inform the decisions we should make about English language development services, Tier 1 supports, and when students might need Tier 2 or Tier 3 interventions? And so we're coming at this from a research perspective. It makes me so happy to have the folks who are coming at it from the policy perspective here, because those things I think are kind of in conversation with each other as we move forward.
So we'll start with some of the terms. You hear us using multilingual learner and English language development. So within our research, those are the terms they use with the people that we looked at. So multilingual learner and ELD is what we'll use today. So you guys know it as English learner, English language learner. You'll hear multilingual learner for that piece. And then the second piece is ESL. We're going to use ELD. And again, this is more progressive language. It might not be their second language. So we want to make sure that we're emphasizing that they're bringing more than just, you know, English is not just the most important thing. They're bringing more to us. So we want to use more progressive language today. So I want you guys to read this, and then I want you to kind of think about what it says and kind of discuss it with your partner. Chat and kind of think about, what does this mean? What do you notice?
When you've read through the quote, feel free to turn and talk to a neighbor about how are you interpreting this passage from the National Committee on Effective Literacy?
Well, I think it's stating something that is a problem in the U.S. in general.
Yes.
Because I come from a reading background, and so to me, reading and writing are life skills.
Yes, yes.
Foundational reading skills of a native language. So you have to start from scratch.
Yes, and at third grade, that's not part of the instructional practice, the core instructional practice.
Exactly. And so it really relies on us and any instructional aids that we have to help reinforce that time.
That key things that need to exist for every student. That's a huge difference for our class. I 100%.
Okay, if you'll take just a moment to wrap up your conversations, and we'd love to hear from the group today. What are the things that you noticed? What are the connections that you made with this quote? We've got our microphone runner in the back, so anybody, and a microphone runner over here, anybody who would be willing to share.
Well, what I teach students is that reading and writing are life skills. Without those, you have no life. And so many teachers teach that mid-level. They miss the high ones because they're bored to death. They miss the low ones because they don't get it, and you hit the in-betweens. Personally, I don't teach that way, and I've been asked many times, well, this is the curriculum. I said, yeah, these are the skills they need. I don't have to teach what it says here. I'm going to teach it the way my kids get it because I have them all over the place.
So you're really focused on that one-size-fits-all approach and problematizing that one size doesn't fit all, because our learners bring with them diverse learning profiles.
Correct.
Other ideas that came up in conversation. Anybody else willing to share?
I was just saying that kids that come in really third grade and up, they're missing those foundational skills. And I mean, a lot of our kids are coming in middle and high school, and our secondary teachers are not trained, are comfortable teaching those foundational skills like phonics and the sounds of the English language.
Typically, I take a positive approach to things, all things. But I read this and I feel frustrated because this is not new. Decades of research has supported the importance of early literacy and foundational skills, and research has supported the need for all teachers to intervene and support that regardless of grade level, regardless of subject. But then I see different curriculum coming out, different things being promoted, announcements like this, and I think, okay, what now? What is the next step? How are teachers, with the responsibilities that are placed on them, given targeted time and tools to be able to do this? And so then I see you two up here giving those tools, and I really appreciate it, but I do wish more people had access to it or knew that they needed access to it.
So I want to make sure I'm understanding. I think I understand what you're saying. So is part of what you're saying that you feel like there is a disconnect between research and practice, or is it that you feel that teachers are asked to do kind of like divergent things and have a hard time making sense of them?
Yes.
Both.
Yes
Okay.
to both.
Okay. Great. I believe there was, okay.
Okay, great points here. So I see that with phonics, it is critical for our native English speakers, right? And we also need to teach our English learners how to read as well. However, like we're seeing, we're having students who come in and they're not literate in their native language. So it's like we have a sixth grader coming in and we're teaching, the ESL teacher is the one where those foundational skills are pushed upon to help them to learn to read, because when they get in the real world, that's what they need to be able to do, read and write, right? So this is the concern of, okay, the materials that you have to help teach teenagers to read, we need to use age appropriate, right? And a lot of that is not based on the content from what I have seen. So I know there are some publishing companies that have went out there and they've made more age appropriate to help teach some of these phonics skills, but there is a lack. And I do see, because I've got my specialist in reading degree, so I know that there is some disconnect with, okay, all this research that comes out a lot is based on native English speakers. Where does it come to our ELs and all the different languages that they have, right? So that's one critical thing that I struggle with trying to support my teachers and my students. How can I do that? So it's like, okay, we have all these phonics skills that changes every single week. It's like, okay, yes, I need my students to know this, but is it, okay, we need them to know maybe the most essential that's going to be in the language that they're going to be reading in English the most, not all 15, 20 skills. So I feel like there's a whole lot that has to be taken into consideration when we're talking about literacy. And how does that look when you have a classroom dynamic made up of different students and their needs, right?
Yeah. So literacy is a complex phenomenon. And there's a lot of considerations going back to the one-size-fits-all approach, especially when we're working with multilingual learners. Are they literate in another language? And can those literacy skills from L1 be bootstrapped to L2? Or are they learning to read are they learning to read in a language that they're also simultaneously learning? That's a huge factor as we consider what's the best way to teach them to read. So to start with, we're going to talk a little bit about the foundations. And so when we think about who are English learners, as we were just talking about, English learner is a label that feels like a kind of monolithic label for such a heterogeneous population, right? When we talk about English learners, we're talking about students who may or may not be literate in their first language, who may or may not have attended school consistently. who may speak multiple languages other than English, whose parents may have variable backgrounds in their own education or socioeconomic status. So there's a lot of variety that comes into the types of students that we're serving. I want to point out two really important categories, though, when we're thinking about what it means to be a multilingual or a bilingual. The first is whether the person is a sequential or simultaneous bilingual. So most of the students that we work with in elementary schools are what we would call simultaneous bilingual. So most of the students we work with in elementary schools were born in the US and live in households where languages other than English are spoken, but are exposed to English as they are simultaneously exposed to another language or possibly other languages. And so they're hearing multiple languages and interacting in multiple languages across the contexts where they live their lives. A sequential bilingual is, I'm a sequential bilingual. I learned English first, and then I learned German, and I lived in Germany. And so I learned one language first and then learned another language second. And that impacts the way that those two languages relate to each other. So in our classrooms, we might have students who are sequential bilinguals who learned other languages first and then are now adding English on top. And we may have simultaneous bilinguals who have acquired English as they are acquiring other languages and sort of fluidly move back and forth between those languages. As we look at the language backgrounds, and this is Tennessee data. In Tennessee, most of our students who are multilingual learners speak Spanish. Approximately half of the multilingual learners that we work with are Spanish speakers. Arabic is the second language, but you can see there's a huge gap there, right? 50% versus 5%. But Arabic is another commonly found language. But as many of you have already alluded to, you might have 100 plus different languages represented in your school districts. We might have Vietnamese speakers, Kurdish, Somali, Karen, Lao, Mandarin, Gujarati, German, Japanese, Korean. So our students vary not just in the ways, the sequence that they learn languages, but also the different languages that they speak. And English learners are defined by their language background, right? We just reviewed it, that you start with the home language survey and then they're given a screener. So really the defining characteristic is language background. However, English learners have what we would call, most of them have what we all have, intersectional identities. So when we think about multilingualism, multilingualism in and of itself is not a predictor for being at risk or having low academic achievement. So being multilingual is not a risk factor. Being multilingual is a superpower. But when we think about students who are multilingual, they often face other challenges. They are often from racial or ethnic backgrounds that are stigmatized and marginalized in our society. They have variable immigration status. Many were born in the US, some were not. Some have parents who may or may not be citizens. And so concerns about whether they have equal access to all of the opportunities in the US can play into their school experience. And probably one of the biggest factors is socioeconomic status. So if we look at, this is data from a great, it's linked here at the bottom, Part of Us, a data-driven look at children of immigrants across the US. 1 in 4 children in the United States have an immigrant parent. So when this report is labeled Part of Us, that's like 25% of children in the US have an immigrant parent. So immigrants are not something to the side. Immigrants are part of us, part of our experience, part of the fabric of our society. 60% of children who have an immigrant parent in the US have at least one parent who is a US citizen, and 90% of those children are US citizens. So most of the children that we work with are US citizens, have at least one parent who's a US citizen, but are children of immigrants and have a different experience because of their relationship with family members who are immigrants. In immigrant families in the US, 21% of parents have less than a high school diploma. Now, this still means that like 80% have, a little less than 80% have a high school diploma. But when you compare that to non-immigrant parents, that's like 5% don't have a high school diploma. So immigrant families in the US have, in general, parents who have less education. And that impacts students' school experiences. However, 92% of parents who are in immigrant families work. So immigrant families are really critical contributors to our economy. 83% of immigrant families have two-parent families. 49% have low incomes. So 92% work, but 42 have low incomes. In spite of that work, are struggling to make ends meet. And this shapes our students' experiences.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the rights. So really the basis of how our programs began. It really begins with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where schools were integrated. So we really want to begin there. But we'll talk about one of the big cases in our pedagogy is Lau versus Nichols. So this was a case in California where a Chinese family, they were really challenging the courts because their child was not getting equal access to the curriculum because he didn't know English. So they brought that before the court and it went to the Supreme Court. And this is kind of where they, made the decision on, okay, we have to provide services, some sort of service for this child because it's not fair for him to sit in a classroom all day and not receive any instruction that's comprehensible. So this kind of changed everything for us, and this is kind of where we began. So it says there's no equality of treatment by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum for students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. It's not meaningful for them to sit there and just have to hear English all day. So this is kind of where it began. The second piece of this is it said basic English skills are at the very core of what public schools teach, right? Wouldn't we? Yes, we all agree with that. Imposition of a requirement that before a child can effectively participate in the educational program, he must already have acquired those basic skills is to make a mockery of public education. So this is kind of the roots of how our programs began. It was with Lau versus Nichols. Another important case was Castañeda versus Pickard. This was in 1981. So this case was in Texas, where a father of two daughters, they were also not getting equal education, and he wanted to advocate for bilingual education for his children. So he brought that before the court, and this is where our basis of we have to have sound programs now. You can't just throw a kid in there and not monitor that program. So these are the three pieces that came from that. Districts must have a pedagogically sound plan, which the state has made sure that they must have sufficient qualified staff. So we have to have those qualified ELD teachers. And then you have to have a way of monitoring it, making sure that you're following the rules to that. So this is another case that came up. Then our final case is Plyer versus Doe. This was in Texas in the 1980s. So this was a case where a father had issues with his kids not being admitted into school because they were undocumented. So that is completely illegal. So that's how we changed that status and made sure that regardless of your status, or if you're undocumented or not, you have access to education. So these are some of the cases that we that set the standard for what we do today. So I just wanted to kind of share that with you guys, which you should already know because y'all are all experts in it, but a little background on that. So now students receive English language development support. So we make sure that that is a right for all of our multilingual learners. They have access to grade level academic content. Grade level, I want to emphasize grade level, so making sure they have that access. And then access to any and all opportunities available to other students. That's our RTI support. So we're going to talk a little bit about that because I think that is a big struggle that we have within our state. But we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then access to primary language support. We have that crossed out because That's one thing that we are not really touching in Tennessee, access to that primary language, which research shows that it's important for them to have that access. So I can't change it. I don't have a magic wand, but if I could, I would make sure that's happening. So here's some demographic shifts that we're seeing in Tennessee. We know that Tennessee is a new immigration destination. A lot of our refugees are in Nashville. They're being sent to Chattanooga, Cleveland, Tennessee, those areas. So this is a hot spot for immigration and refugees, and we're seeing that across the districts everywhere. Even within our district, we've had a 66% increase in Murfreesboro City Schools in the last 3 years of multilingual learners. So we're changing significantly. And it says Tennessee had a 45% growth in EL or ML population from 2011 to 2017, which is old data. Like, think about what it looks like now. So
from 2018 to 2023.
Thank you for that. So we are growing. We're growing, and I know you guys are seeing it all across the state. And here's some of our state level data, and you can correct me on this because I really tried to find as much as I could, but we have 26% of our students met their growth standard in 2020 to 2021. We didn't have data for those years before because of COVID, but this is kind of what I found. So we didn't do so well that year, but last year we were at about 43% of our students met their growth standard, their growth trajectory. So we are making improvements. We did find in this was in the framework, Tennessee framework for multilingual learners, is that our goal is 75%. I don't know if that's changed.
Probably.
Our goal was 75% by 2025. So it looks like we have some work to do, right, in growing students on that WIDA access test. So just keep that in mind. It may change. I don't know. The state is here so they can provide information on that. But we have some work to do in growth, right, if we want to meet this goal. So now I want you to this is going to be very interactive, to turn to your partner and kind of think about how do these national and state demographics compare to your school or district. So kind of talk about where you are as a district or as a school and where you want to go.
And we're about the same. We're about 40, 43 as of last year. But we don't have the district yet.
We are showing progress with more students meeting their growth.
And then our second group, of course, is here. But in our district, we probably have, 40 different languages. But my school is one of the smaller populated schools for EL students, yeah.
And I was so happy to see the district-wide percentage of students meeting the growth standard. Mm-hmm. 2 years ago, it was terrible, with COVID, with the pandemic.
Yeah. Okay, so let's come back together. I really quickly wanted to hit back on this protected rights slide because it does inform the overall organization of our presentation today. So students have protected rights to receive English language development instruction. That was part of Lauvick versus Nichols, that students deserve access to learn English, and that English learning is a protected right. The other thing, though, is the access to grade level content, and we can't make language a prerequisite for participation. Students need to, from day one, be actively engaged in learning grade level content. And those two things are different objectives, and they kind of interweave. They make sense together, but they are two distinct rights. And the last is that students should have access and opportunity to any other available support. So I know it's come up. It's a key issue is how do we disentangle language difference from language disability? Because if students, multilingual students, have a learning disability, then they also have protected rights to receive supports according to those learning disabilities. So these are the three protected rights. As Ariel mentioned, research suggests that primary language is, primary language support, bilingual education, is the most effective way, not only for students to learn academic content, but also to learn language. However, there is no federal protected right, or certainly not state protected right, for students to access that primary language support. So as I was saying earlier, research and policy are in conversation with each other, right? So research there's a huge body of research that suggests that multilingual, bilingual education is the most effective way, but it's not a federally protected right like these others are. So now we're moving into part 2, the relationship between language and literacy. And this is another quote from the National Committee of Effective Literacy. Language processing in the bilingual mind differs from the monolingual mind. The development of literacy for a dual language brain is not the same as for a monolingual brain. The new language and literacy system is developed in the presence of and in interaction with the existing language system. And so as we think about the importance of literacy development for all students, we need to be cognizant of the differences for multilingual learners. So a seminal article that came out in 1989 by François Grosjean, who is himself a bilingual and a simultaneous bilingual, points out to neurolinguistic researchers that the bilingual is not simply two monolinguals in one, which is the way that neurolinguistics has treated bilingualism for a long time. In the bilingual brain, languages don't function separately. It's not like there's a English-speaking self and a Spanish-speaking self, that these languages coexist in a holistic system in the brain. So while students' brains function from this multilingual perspective, our multilingual learners that we serve every day, schools tend to function from a monolingual lens. So we are constantly assessing, instructing, operating as if our students are monolingual students when they are multilingual. So here's an example of a piece of writing. Dr. Sung-Yin Lee, who helped us develop this, this is some writing that his son did. And his son is a simultaneous bilingual, has grown up speaking Korean and English his whole life. And Sung-Yoon and his wife are also both bilingual. They speak Korean and English. And so throughout the day, the family slides back and forth between Korean and English because they're communicating with others who also speak both languages, right? This is not a temporary crutch until they can all learn English proficiently because they're not getting rid of the Korean. They're using both languages fluidly. So I'm going to ask you to turn and talk to your neighbor. What do you notice about this writing that Sung-Yoon's son wrote when he was 7 years old? This is a letter to his mother. Right? His mother is a Korean English speaker. He's a Korean and English speaker. He's a Korean and English speaker. So he wrote this letter to his mother. Turn and talk. What do you notice about this piece of writing?
I don't care. If I knew some Korean, I would say, yeah, I care. Video. Looks like about friendly. So it sounds.
Okay, let's have our microphone runners help us gather some observations. What did you all notice about this piece of writing?
It's apparent that the two languages are mixed.
Yeah, right? They're free. That he is freely mixing the languages. Other kind of details about how the languages are mixed.
He is spelling the words, the English words, the way that he hears them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which is a normal developmental process, right? As students are learning to encode language, they spell what they hear. Other things that we noticed. Yes, here's one.
He can write in his home language, so he definitely understands the symbols of language, so he has that foundation, not only in English he's starting to, but also in Korean as well.
Yep. And that's not something he got at school, right? He's learned that elsewhere, to encode South Korean language with the South Korean, or with the Korean script.
What about the structure? Does he understand the structure of how a sentence goes?
Yeah, we've got a capital there and a period at the end, so kind of mixing the conventions.
Doesn't it go from top to bottom instead of right to left?
No,
Left
it's
to
going.
right?
It's going right to left.
It is going right
It's
to
going
left?
right to left.
I mean,
yep.
left to...
Left to right.
Left to right. Sorry. Yes, you would read it like you would read an English page. But we notice that it's not like one line is in one language and the other is the next. He sort of freely mixes based on which words he thinks has more impact. And that's because he's writing for an audience that he knows can understand both languages. I wish that Sung-Yoon were here to actually read it and interpret it. I don't speak Korean, so I'm not going to be able to read it, but I will tell you roughly what it means. Something to the extent of his wife was doing, analyzing video data on the laptop, and his son says, "Mom, you don't care about friendship, you only care about watching videos." So he was wanting his mother's attention and used the tools at his disposal to communicate his need to her, which is what reading and writing is all about, right? So when we think about the science of reading, we're talking about converging evidence of what works in literacy instruction. And this is a solid research base that we cannot afford to ignore. I know reading is one of those things that tends to be people have strong value attachments to reading. And often the ways we were taught to read or the ways that we were taught to teach reading really resonate with us. So the science of reading is converging research evidence across multiple disciplines that really tells us what works. These practices are evidence-based. They're proven by extensive research to effectively teach children how to read. And there's a couple of key theoretical frameworks that undergird what we would refer to as the body of the science of reading. One is what's called the simple view of reading, and the other is Scarborough's rope. Another more recent that I really love is the active view of reading that Nell Duke and colleagues have kind of expounded upon. But these three theories of reading are really essential for understanding how literacy instruction works. And the simple view of a reading is a theory that attempts to define the skills that contribute to early reading comprehension. We'll talk about high school students a little bit later, but the simple view of reading was really developed with those early readers. And it relies on sort of a mathematical concept of the product, right? It's a cognitive model. So one of the criticisms that comes up of the simple view of reading often is that it doesn't consider sociocultural context, that it's really focused on what's happening in a person's brain. And we all know as people who work with multilingual learners that sociocultural context is critical. That's not something that comes into play when we're thinking about this theoretical model. However, it's a model that has really high explanatory power, really, I think, too high to ignore. That in several different studies that have been repeated over and over again, the science of reading can explain almost 90% of the variance in students' ability to read. So the simple view of reading states that reading comprehension is the product. That's a really important thing. It's the product of decoding and language comprehension. Not the sum, it's the product. So, some of you may be proficient in the International Phonetic Alphabet. Others may not. If you're not, then you might have trouble decoding what this is saying, because it's in an alphabet that's difficult or impossible for you to decode. If you're unable to decode the sounds, if you're unable to break the code, can you read what this says? No, right? It's the product. If you're decoding the sounds as 0%, but if I read it to you, is this chicken or fish? How's your language comprehension? 100%, right? But when we think about the simple view of reading, we're thinking about the product. So if your ability to decode is 0% and your language comprehension is 100%, what is your reading comprehension? It's still 0, right? So the ability to decode is critical. It's very important that all of our students learn to decode English texts. However, the ability to comprehend the language is also critical. So this is a Finnish phrase, and Finnish has a language that's considered a transparent orthography. So each letter represents a sound, and it's very straightforward. So even though, is anybody in here a Finnish speaker? Anybody speak Finnish? No? But I bet we could all read it. Let's try together, right? On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Kuusi pala. Oh, you guys did awesome. We're not Finnish speakers, but we can decode what this says, right? So our decoding skill is 100%. But do we know what it means? No, we do not. And therefore, our reading comprehension is 0. We don't understand. So when we think about the simple view of reading, it says that that reading comprehension is the product of our ability to decode and our ability to comprehend the language. So word recognition is necessary. We must make sure that our students have those foundational skills to decode what they're reading. However, it is necessary but not sufficient. Simply teaching students to decode is not enough. They need solid language background. And many criticisms of the simple view of reading point to the fact that this language side of things is under-theorized and underdeveloped. What does it mean to comprehend language? And as language acquisition people, I'm sure that's something, I see lots of nods, that's something we can relate to, that the language piece of it is really essential. So word recognition is necessary but not sufficient for reading comprehension. So right now in the state of Tennessee, there's a heavy focus on sounds. Literally called sounds first, right? Sounds are critical. I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. However, it's not sufficient, right? And particularly for multilingual learners, they need language development alongside foundational skill development from an early age. So we see in policy and research and practice a much heavier emphasis on foundational skills, on phonemic awareness and phonics, than on language comprehension. Why do you think that is? If you'll turn and talk to your neighbors, why do we see this heavy emphasis on our foundational skills rather than language development?
It's just like it's not there for some kind of guided reading, whatever that small group reading would be. If that's disappearing, I could see a problem there.
All right, let's get some hypotheses from the crowd. Let's have our microphone runners help us out here. What are some thoughts that you have about why we see a heavy emphasis on foundational skills rather than language comprehension?
In our discussion, I said that there's a huge push for meeting the needs of students with dyslexia. Mm-hmm. And we know that students who have dyslexia need explicit foundational skills instruction. So that may be a factor.
Mm-hmm. It's a very important factor. And it may be something that students, my colleagues who work in the Dyslexia Center would say that the needs of students with characteristics of dyslexia have been not emphasized enough, right? So this is an attempt to sort of be a little bit more corrective in terms of, and could multilingual learners have dyslexia? Absolutely, absolutely. So it's not an either or scenario. Great point. Other points that you discussed in your conversations?
We talked about how it's always going back and forth with research, and that's where we are today. And I think as a society, we think it has to be one direct answer of how to fix a problem. And that I think mentally we have to look at that. We have to look at multiple pieces of data, information, the student. And it could also be that language, we take the role of language out so often because we see it as English is what we're all speaking, right? So we don't concentrate enough on that. And so now that we're seeing it with our native English students, that the communication is lacking at home, they're missing that vocabulary, they're missing a lot of the language that we assume that they have. And so therefore that language component is impacted as well. So we're seeing it not just solely in our multilingual learners, but our native English speakers as well.
So it's sort of taken for granted. Language is what we use all the time, so everybody has it. We just sort of assume that it's there, is maybe one piece.
What we said in our group was, if there's no foundation, there's no starting point. Okay. Because you need the foundation to go somewhere.
Okay.
And sometimes you need to build the foundation and then go somewhere.
So you're talking about a language foundation then, or are you
Yes.
talking about a skills foundation, or both?
We're talking language and lack of skills, possibly.
Possibly. So there's a few different reasons, I think some that you've already alluded to, but why we may see a heavy emphasis on foundational skills. One is, I think, the way that this issue is framed in the media versus the way that it's framed in research. So here are a couple of excerpts, and I'm going to ask you to think through which one you think is a researcher and which one you think is a journalist. Our concern is that although reading science is highly relevant to learning in the classroom setting, it does not yet speak to what to teach, when, how, and for whom at a level that is useful for teachers. This was published in 2020. Another piece published in 2020 says, cognitive scientists have found that phonics is the best way for the brain to learn to read. Right? So which one do you think is a scientist, A or B?
A.
A, right? Scientists, man, the more you become a researcher, the more carefully you hedge every single thing that you say. Like, we may have found something possibly if the factors align perfectly, right? Researchers are much more cautious about the claims that we make based on the evidence. Journalists often want a quick headline, right? And so there's a tendency to interpret the research in a way that I think, as you mentioned, sort of makes it appear as if phonics could be a silver bullet that would solve all the problems with literacy in the nation. And certainly phonics is essential for helping students be successful readers, but there's so many factors that go into reading. It's a very complex phenomenon. So that's one issue that contributes to a focus on foundational skills rather than language. Another key issue is when we think about decoding as a constrained skill. So when we talk about word recognition versus language comprehension, word recognition is easier to measure, right? It's very easy to give students a list of words and see how many of them can they recognize in a certain number of time. It's easier to master and show growth. I know that when I was a teacher and I got the chance to choose for my kindergarten and first graders whether I would choose a letter name Ames Web measure versus like a listening comprehension measure. Ooh, I'd do Ames Web anytime, right? Because I'm going to show growth a lot more quickly. It's easier to teach systematically. A key idea with the science of reading is that instruction is explicit and systematic. And when we have a constrained skill, meaning there's only so many letters in the alphabet, there's only so many phonics forms that we can put together, then that makes it easy to teach systematically. What does it mean to teach language systematically? Right? Language is not constrained. Language is infinite. People are coming up with new ways to use language every single day. Language is dynamic, which makes it much more difficult to measure, to master, to teach systematically, and for the purposes of kind of research, to show significant effect sizes. It's a lot harder to do that when we think about language. So when we think about phonics and phonemic awareness, there's a relatively small number of elements in these foundational skills, whereas language is conceptually unbound. For example, knowing the alphabet versus knowing all the words there are to know. Vocabulary is totally unconstrained. There can be very precise assessments for these foundational skills, and the skills or the assessments for vocabulary, reading comprehension. Oh my goodness, writing. I love writing. Writing is so hard to measure. It's very, very hard to measure. So the more unconstrained a skill is, the less certain we are that we're doing it the right way. And so here's sort of a spectrum of highly constrained skills, such as learning to write your name or learning the alphabet, learning a constrained list of high-frequency words, learning to decode nonsense words, applying phonological awareness, from constrained to unconstrained. And the closer we get into language, vocabulary, and comprehension, the less constraint we have in trying to measure and understand those things. So language comprehension is an important component of reading that develops alongside decoding. So one perhaps misunderstanding with language like sounds first is that we really need to focus on that before we focus on language. But the science of reading will say that both need to be developed at the same time, and that oral language fluency is really, really critical. So language comprehension is an important component of reading that develops alongside decoding and becomes ever more important in the reading process as students move through the elementary grades. Thus, in conversations about the science of reading, language comprehension and how to support its development among diverse learners, diverse populations, should not be overlooked. So this is a this is a quote from a meta-analysis that Silverman and colleagues did to show the effects of language interventions on improving language comprehension. They're really making the argument that we really need to focus on language alongside these foundational skills. So, one key document that has really informed literacy policy in the US is the National Reading Panel that came out in the year of 2000. And that's where we get, you may have heard of like the 5 pillars. You all know what the 5 pillars are? Let's say them. Phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, reading comprehension, right? These 5 pillars really come out of this critical report from 2000, and a key finding from that report is that we need systematic and explicit instruction in component reading skills. However, something that I think is really relevant for this presentation is for you to understand that when they were synthesizing the research, if they came across a study that had more than, I think it was 30% bilingual students, they threw it out. So this report only studied monolingual English speakers. It was not informed by research with multilingual learners. It's often misunderstood from this report that instruction should put a greater emphasis on phonemic awareness and phonics, but that's a misunderstanding. The report emphasized all 5 pillars, and vocabulary and comprehension, including language comprehension, are critical pieces of that. So, as you might imagine, there were people who were pretty upset that multilingual learners were completely ignored in the National Reading Panel report that came out in 2000. So a follow-up happened in 2006. This was called a report of the National Literacy Panel for Language Minority Children and Youth. And it studied specifically the needs of multilingual learners and English learners. And they found, in their synthesis of the research, that language minority students and monolingual students, by the time they get, if they've been in school from kindergarten on, by the time they get in kind of 2nd, 3rd grade, actually typically, if you look across the United States, have equivalent word reading skills. So in other words, the ability to decode and spell is something that English learners tend to catch up with their peers on. But that's not the case for text-level skills, like reading comprehension and writing. And part of their hypothesis there is that language development is especially critical for multilingual learners. It's not that we don't ever teach them phonics, but that language development piece is really important. Students benefit significantly from the integration of language development with content, with an emphasis on meaning. So we are quite a bit early here, but we'll take questions that you all might have.
Well, hello again. So I'm taking in all this information. And so I just have like a question to you guys. So what I'm looking at is, okay, if we use a certain curriculum, right, to deliver the instruction, certain vocabulary, certain content to our students, and then we use a different assessment piece to assess them. So this assessment might be using content they've never got background knowledge on. It's just completely different. So then we're using this assessment to make these important decisions. So I almost, in my mind, this is what I'm thinking, but I know there's going to be pros and cons to it, that if we're going to use a certain curriculum to have our instruction to our students, our English learners, then the assessment piece, our benchmarking or whatever, should coincide or somehow correlate with that, because that's how they've built their background knowledge. So the con to that is that, okay, we're limiting them to certain vocabulary and things like that. What would you recommend? Because I'm just thinking of there has to be...
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so what you're getting at is that reading comprehension is really difficult to measure. And you're pointing to the importance of background knowledge for reading comprehension. And that is so Dr. Amy Elliman, who's here at MTSU, is a nationally recognized expert in reading comprehension. And her work really emphasizes the importance of background knowledge. I know I had the experience as a teacher. Maybe you've had this experience too, where I spent a whole semester with my third grade group hammering main idea and supporting detail. Man, we worked main idea and supporting detail. We broke those apart. We used graphic organizers. They could tell you the main idea and supporting detail. And then we get to the benchmark assessment, and it's like Rikki Tikki Tavi and the mongoose. And they're like, what's a mongoose, right? And so then my administrator comes back to me and says, well, your kids don't know main idea and supporting detail. I'm like, I promise you they know main idea and supporting detail. They don't know about what a mongoose is. And so, yes, the importance of background knowledge is really, really critical for reading comprehension. There's another study that came out sort of in the 80s, working particularly with like middle school students. I think they were 5th and 6th graders. It's the baseball study. Have you all heard the baseball study before? That if students, they assess students on their background knowledge of baseball, their general reading proficiency, and it turned out the students who had better background knowledge of baseball outperformed students who didn't. Like the low reading proficiency readers were able to compensate with their background knowledge. So that background knowledge piece is really, really important. In terms of implications for assessment, it's really tricky. I think part of the idea behind the Common Core or other curricular shifts is this focus on knowledge building blocks, so that students, but it seems a little bit like cheating to like align the knowledge with the assessment that's going to happen after. And from a research sciencey perspective, I would want the comprehension measure to be separate from the knowledge measure somehow, but teasing those out gets really tricky. Yeah, you brought up great points. Yes?
Thanks for bringing all of this and kind of capturing a lot of research in a short amount of time here for us. I was thinking about, we were talking about the bilingual students and sequential bilingualism and simultaneous. Thank you, like that. I'm wondering if you could point me to any kind of research about students who are actually, I don't know what to call it. English becomes a replacement language from their original language. So they lose their first language and do not maintain the same pace with that. As they're learning English, they don't gain enough English to replace what they're losing. So they end up with this gap. It's not being replaced at home. They're not like Dr. Lee's family, which has a really rich language environment at home. They're not in that kind of a thing. So are there studies about that where students are having these huge gaps in any language?
Yes, there is. There is quite a bit of work on that. And honestly, the most recent research has pointed to the ways we frame those students. So I'll bring it up, or maybe I can show you now and I'll come back to it. Again, thinking about multilingual learners from a monolingual lens. What you're saying here is this student is not learning as much Spanish, for example, as a Spanish speaker, because they're not exposed to it as often. Mom and dad are working 2 or 3 jobs, and they're certainly not learning Spanish in school, right? And then at school, they're learning English, but their English background is not as strong, and so they appear as if they might have limited language across both languages. And so this is a study that I did in Tennessee with some colleagues where we gave an assessment which is called a conceptually scored vocabulary assessment. So a pretty common vocabulary assessment is one that's called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, where there are like 4 images, for example, and you ask students to point to the table, and they have to point to the image that's the table. Or in the inverse, you might show them a picture and then they have to tell you what it is. So that's a PPVT, and typically you might think of those as happening in English, or maybe we might, so sometimes what happens in schools is we'll say, okay, they didn't do so well on the English, let's give them the same assessment in Spanish. And what you're pointing to is, well, they're not going to do so great on that Spanish assessment either, right? Because they're not getting Spanish at school, they're not getting a whole lot of Spanish at home. And so the conceptually scored vocabulary assessment allows them to respond in either language and attempts to measure their vocabulary knowledge across these two languages. And so what we found is that when bilingual students were permitted to give responses across languages, they actually, on average, looked pretty normal, right? However, we were also able to get a bell curve where we were able to see those students who, when normed against bilinguals and are permitted to respond across both languages, have less vocabulary than their bilingual peers. And so that was a very useful measure to indicate, okay, this might be a student who has low vocabulary across both languages. But so the research is looking at it in a couple of different ways. One is, how are we framing those students? It may be that they actually have pretty strong vocabulary if you count it across both languages, instead of trying to measure and norm them against monolingual students. But also we need a mechanism for figuring out who are those who do have language difficulties that need to be remediated and addressed. Great question.
Thank you. I don't know if this is so much of a question, but definitely a connection that I'm having. Before coming back to Tennessee, I was working in Lexington, Kentucky with refugee populations. And I found myself in this very interesting situation where we had 130 refugee students in one school, 200 multilingual learners. And during this 1 year, we were experiencing a really huge influx of kids, so much that we, ended up hiring, I think, 6 new ESL teachers that 1 year. It was right before the last administration came in. Everybody was trying to get the families through the pipeline and get them placed. So we're talking 10 plus kids a week coming in. And these were children who had not attended school. So these were kids from the DRC and from Syria. So it was very interesting because these are kids coming in with no literacy skills, or perhaps maybe the ability to write their name. And we had such a large cohort of students that for me, I've got a researcher, mind, and was like, oh my gosh, this is something I've never gotten to see in my career. I've had a few kids here, but now I've got this large cohort. So we hired these new folks, and what we decided, okay, we're going to have these 4th and 5th graders in a language workshop in the afternoon. We had over 30 students, these brand new newcomers, and we decided, okay, that we'll have 3 of us in the room, and we'll divide this task up. So we had, what do you want to teach? What do I want to teach? So one of our new ESL teachers, she said, well, I've been trained in multisensory phonics. She said, I would love to try this out. And I'm thinking, great, because I've never felt super confident in teaching phonics. And I've been a program coordinator before going back into the classroom, so I felt like I wasn't so great in that area. So I thought, I'll do the world language and the writing, and then you do the phonics, and then we have another teacher that's going to do small group reading. And when I started seeing her implement this with kids, I sat at her feet, literally, and thought, what is this magic that I'm seeing? And what I saw happen was within a short amount of time that all of these kids learned to decode and encode. And it wasn't something that was long-term ongoing. This was something that needed to be taught, and then we could move on. And my big takeaway is this is not a this or that. They still needed oral language development. They still need to be working with me in the back corner with me playing guitar and teaching them all the great English things that they needed to learn and be in this small group. But if they didn't have that decoding and encoding system in English or in any language, they weren't going to be able to get it. And what was really amazing is seeing those kids come back after middle school coming in reading chapter books. And so I was so taken by it that I went and I did action research for a year. I went and got trained, and I said, I'm going to see what happened here. Why did this happen this way? And so really kind of what I found was, it's not a this or that for me. It is, they need this piece, and particularly for an older learner, it's a short sprint. They can learn that very quickly, but they still need the oral language development. And those things put together, it was really, really powerful. And I was able to see so many kids' lives change, where if it would have just been me, I would have been, really struggling. But I was really fortunate to have her there with those skills. So going back to like teacher training, I hadn't had that teacher training. But once I got it, it definitely changed, the way that I teach, and now I train all of my teachers in this methodology. So anyway, this what kind of made me connect with that it's not necessarily one or the other, that it's both pieces, and then having that really good professional development to learn how to teach that way.
That's our whole presentation. We're done. So good.
One of the things, Scarborough's rope is another image, and I really love the way that Scarborough's rope interweaves the two. So when we're talking about word recognition skills, one of the misunderstandings that I used to have as a teacher is I'm like, well, they can say the alphabet, but it's not just about knowing, it's about knowing it in a way that's automatic. So that the word recognition becomes automatic, and there's not cognitive space used up to recognize those words. And so what's so powerful about multisensory phonics instruction is that it provides multiple routes for those skills to become automatic for students, so that they then just recognize the words. And it is a little bit like magic, or like surgery even, rewiring those neural pathways to help students recognize the code immediately, so that they don't belabor that and it keeps them from comprehending what's going on in the text. We'll be coming back after lunch to think a little bit more about the theory to practice connection. You'll hear a lot more from Ariel after lunch as we think about what are the programmatic implications for this research.